Serious, have you ever watched as someone's world fell apart in a moment? What happened? I was speaking privately in my office with one of my employees when a call came through on my office phone that there was an urgent call for the employee. I handed over my phone and managed to catch her as she crumpled moments later. Her dad, who'd been missing for 2 days, had just been found deceased. A coworker of mine lost her family member in a natural disaster. I found out about it when I read an interview with her in a national newspaper. It was shocking. She hasn't been back to work since and it has been almost a year. I wonder how she is doing. My mom, when my stepdad died, she came through the door and the only way I could describe how she sounded was a high-pitched squealing cry. I felt so bad. He was so good to her and she has been through a lot. A high-pitched squealing cry. I don't know which is worse, the high-pitched cry or the low guttural moan that comes from the bottom of your soul. At a small local store, a truck had reversed and hit a small 10-year-old boy who was scootering past. Ambulance and police everywhere. The boy's mom was right beside the boy and a huge crowd had gathered. The paramedic pronounced him dead after a few moments of struggling and the mom screamed. A real low, deep, pain scream that I can't forget. She got up and walked almost in slow motion, more of a limp, and headed directly towards me. Her eyes were just dead and she just walked aimlessly and I swiftly left the scene. On the flip side, throughout this whole time, the driver of the work truck had locked himself in the car. He did not leave the car the whole time I was there. The mom tried to get into it at one point and the police were around it. The man was in it, just motionless and not responding to anything. I guess that's two worlds that fell apart in that moment. Imagine for a second hearing the paramedics confirm, "Yep, you killed this child." I mean, it would obviously be the end of the world for the mother, but people tend to forget that the person that did this, no matter how little fault they actually are, will always be the person that killed a child. For the rest of their life. I don't think I would be able to live with that knowledge. Had to tell my brother that our dad died. Mom was in the hospital and she let me know there. On the way I was crying so hard, barely held it together. When I knocked on his door, the casual "what is it" greeted me. Dad died. Oh. I closed the door, went into my room. A few hours later I heard him cry. Broke my heart. Yes, we had to tell my mother my father died. I will never forget that day. It was horrible on all of us, but her reaction was heartbreaking. They got married when they were still teenagers and had been together for 2 months shy of 30 years. It was an on-the-job accident and out of the blue. His workplace called my uncle, mother's brother, dad's best friend, first, and he called all of us. She was the last to find out so we could all be there for her. Even when it's not surprising, it can still be incredibly hard. My grandparents were married since they were, I think, 17 and 19, maybe 18 and 20. My grandfather died after a 2-year battle with cancer when he was about 67. I've never seen anyone so sad as my grandmother that day. She could only repeat, "What will I do now? He's my son," over and over. I was at a friend's parents' house, sitting with her whole family, when friend's sister gets the call that the father of her newborn baby had been crushed to death in a work accident. It was excruciating, because there was nothing I could do for her except leave. She didn't know me, and I was extraneous to her situation. Unfortunately, I was 2 hours from home without transportation, and had to sit awkwardly in their living room until someone else could pick me up. Similar story for me, kinda. I was spending the night at a friend's house. We were probably around 10 at the time, and early in the AM, a cop knocks on the door. His dad was driving home from a night shift and was in a fatal collision with a drunk driver. I will never forget the pain in my aunt when she was told that her daughter, 28 at the time, had passed away in her sleep in another province. She had a hole in her heart that took her. The air went cold, you could hear for miles in the moment it took for the news to sink in. And the wailing. It hurt so bad she literally was saying "OWW" while bawling. The way actors portray moments like these isn't even 1/10 close to the way she was. It felt like that hole in my cousin's heart was black hole swallowing up the both of them. I was close to my cousin, and every now and then my aunt will call me up and ask me to tell her stories of me and her daughter, crying the whole time. God, I wish. I don't even have the right words. I think those calls to her are just what both of you need to continue your grieving and healing. My grandparents were married for 60 years. I saw a lot of people break completely the day my grandfather passed away. My father and both of his brothers, but the most of them all was my grandmother. After a few hours spending time saying goodbye to him as we waited for the mortuary to take him to the funeral home, everyone was saying their final goodbyes to him on the stretcher. My grandma tends to be very calm, cool and collected about her feelings, and I had never seen her cry up until that day. She began to sob over him and say, "I'll see you soon, honey. I'll see you soon." I still get choked up remembering it. I used to work for a cruise line as a host. Translations are a part of the gig. During a cruise going from Rio de Janeiro to Buenos Aires, a lot of Brazilians seemed excited to gamble at the casino. Second day in, the casino host calls me up to translate for a guest. Once I'm there, I see After a lengthy explanation on international waters and how casinos work, he broke down, began crying and begging us to give him some money back, that it was all he had from over 20 years of savings that he for when he got old, around 200k give or take with the currency exchange. He said his wife would leave him and take his daughters if she found out he gambled it all away in a single night. Over the last day came in. I was told by the security office that his wife left him alone at the terminal and he was wailing there. It was a sad week all around. I'm against organized gambling, but he was both stupid and dishonest. I'll take the winnings if I win, and I'll pull this clever loophole that no one else ever thought of if I lose. So don't feel bad. You had no choice, and it was logical consequences of being both an idiot and a cheat. I was shopping at my local supermarket one night. It was the freezer section and the only other person in the aisle was a man, probably 30-40, answering his phone. He immediately collapsed to the floor crying. I honestly don't know what happened, but he managed to pull himself up and rush out of the store. Yes, it's awful. I was pregnant with my son and in the hospital giving birth. I have a friend who was pregnant with twins. I was up walking around, early labor, when I saw her being wheeled down the hall in the stretcher. She looked at me and just said, "I lost them." It broke my heart, and I just felt like an butt, standing there 9 months pregnant. I told her I was so sorry and they wheeled her away to surgery. I turned around and her husband was standing there looking gutted. His wife just went into surgery and he just watched her miscarry 18-week fetuses. He was in a bit of shock, so I sat with him. He asked me if I wanted to see his sons, who had been recovered and were in the hospital. I said yes. They were beautiful tiny boys. My son was born later that night. Very surreal experience. Worked as a nurse in the pediatric intensive care unit for years. If I never watch a father beg for his child live, or hand a mother her dying baby again, it will still be too soon. In the time I was there, I loved the job and thought it was great helping the sickest of sick kids get better, usually, and being able to provide support the family and still try to make a difference on the cases that didn't end as well. But now that I've changed jobs, I realize how traumatic it was, and how much it affects me even years later. I can still hear the voice of the dad pleading for his son to live from the last trauma I responded to before changing jobs. Thank you for your work. Your compassion and kindness surely made an impact on many families regardless of their outcomes. Even as a senior in high school, teachers were just people who existed in a school context but not outside of it. At the end of my senior year, we were all seated in an examination hall ready to take an exam. The place was dead quiet as we waited. A little ways into the exam, the air was ripped apart by the most horrific scream many of us had ever heard in our lives. It felt like it echoed off the walls and bounced back to pierce into our brains. When we looked back, one of our more hardest teachers had collapsed on the ground. None of us knew it at the time, but he apparently had a brother who was in and out of mental institutions quite frequently. That morning he got the call that he had committed suicide. It was painful to watch a man who so many people feared show so much emotional pain. Had a teacher at my high school lose not one, but two of his daughters within a year. I don't know how anyone could have handled that. My sister died 3 years ago. When she was in her casket, I don't know how to write it. I watched my dad and other sister holding on it, because my sister was inside. My sister's BF comes, picks her up, and keep her away from the casket for some time. So I went to pick up my dad, take him away so he wouldn't be so depressed. I have never had felt so adult since. My dad hugged me, and I realized how little and old he was, and skinny. I felt like an adult trying to take care of a child. When she was being taken away to be buried, my dad snaps and tries to hold to that wooden thing, like his life depends on it. Once again I have to hug him, and listen to him saying, "My little daughter, my baby is dead." It was horrible and I never wish to someone to live a similar situation. No parent should have to outlive their child. Co-worker seemed fine for the most part one day, if not a bit stressed. Eventually, toward the end of the day she gets a call and then sort of wanders into my and my supervisor's office looking to be half stressed, half out of it, and informs us that her cousin had just been shot by their husband. Apparently the cousin was going through a brutal divorce and her husband decided to do the worst thing. So he drove over to her home and shot her, before committing suicide himself. Even worse, her parents were visiting and witnessed the entire thing. So she got the news via phone and I wasn't sure what was holding her together as she was talking to us, but she went home soon after. Maybe she was in shock. My aunt, when she found out her daughter not only had stage 4 breast cancer but 2 malignant brain tumors as well. She had 3 kids under the age of 10 when she died. The youngest was only a newborn. What made it so much harder for them is she died around the same age as their sister who had died a few decades before. Almost the exact same manner too. They were both only in their late 40s when it happens. It happened to me. I was in my first assignment as a sales rep on an expo. I was totally freaking out because I was alone and trying to represent the brand and looking for partners. And then my sister called. My mom and her were leaving the hospital. Mom was diagnosed breast cancer. It was very aggressive and they had to do a mastectomy by the end of the month. Otherwise chances were very slim she would hold a year. That hit me like a ton of bricks. Next thing I remember is driving back to the hotel and being stopped by a policeman because I ignored a red light. I have no idea what he saw or how bad I looked, but he asked me some questions, understood what was happening and escorted me to the hotel. I barely remember the next couple days after all the phone calls with my mom and family. Of course, nowadays all of it seems silly. She got the surgery and took it like a champ. Did all the chemotherapy and survived. I married and got a daughter and all these years have been a blessing to have her around. Life is full of surprises. That's a nice cop. Glad your mom's okay. My late husband died a couple days after being hit by a drunk driver while we were visiting his home country. A surgical complication came out of nowhere and he was rushed into another surgery. The surgeon came out and addressed his family and I speak the language, but do not understand medical jargon, dialects, thick accents. The only thing I understood clearly was, "I'm sorry," but the look on his parents' faces. I knew. My husband's father is a pretty aloof man and not very effusive, but the look on his face was agonizing. My world fell apart that day, but my former Phil's world ended. My former Mill and I still miss him, but his father just isn't the same. While his father is actually much more expressive, affectionate now, it is as though something went out behind his eyes. Yes, a pain I know all too well. I am an engineering student and I have had the pleasure of meeting many engineering students. A friend of mine was taking some tough courses: differential equations, dynamics, mechanics and materials, structural analysis. He had been struggling throughout the semester. However, he started to turn it all around at the end. After finals week he felt like he passed every single class. He was on top of the world. The grades came out and I will never forget his face when he looked at his results. It was a face of pure horror and sorrow. He failed every class. An entire semester wasted. He wouldn't talk to me. He did not say a word. He was just there motionlessly. I tried consoling him but he just wouldn't respond. He got up and left. That was the last time I saw him. I did not hear from him after that. 2 months later I find out that he died in a motorcycle accident after veering off the road. After talking to his parents, he was suffering from severe depression after that semester. To anyone still in school, failing a class is not the end of the world, it happens. If you ever feel depressed, make sure you get help. It's hard to fight it alone. I wish my friend knew this. Rest easy, Davis. I was like 15 when my uncle got cancer. He had 3 kids in the age of 6 years. His mother was shocked after hearing this information and almost fainted. He fought 3 years. All family members donated money for chemotherapy, but eventually he died and left 3 children with his mother alone. His wife got divorced and broke up contact. Recently, we heard that the husband of the mother that lost her child got cancer too. He had 3 months to live and died also. The mother, my aunt, was devastated, and I could see in her eyes that she didn't want it to live either anymore. We still help her to this day, and she's doing better. Hopefully she recovers. I was doing a job shadow at a jail. A guy came in for a weekend detention and forgot about the baggie of white powder in his hat. He went from a low-level first-time offender to a felon in about a second, introducing a controlled substance in a correctional facility. It was basically an open and shut case, and he had this look of utter sadness and fear. This was juxtaposed with the funniest thing I've ever seen, which was a guy with SS bolts and a Confederate flag tattoo standing next to a Hispanic guy with Mexican gang tattoos, both rubbing elbows, pointing, and laughing at the poor kid while shouting, "Those aren't my pants." You gotta be a special kind of stupid to leave some coke in your hat while headed to jail. My sister and I had to be the ones to let my mom know that her sister had died in a motorcycle accident. I never knew my aunt. We heard the news from my uncle, and he didn't even have the decency to tell her himself. My mom is mild to moderately mentally disabled, and she literally bawled like a small child. I was 13. It was horrific to witness my mom in such distress. That's horrible. I can't imagine having to do that as an adult, but as a child it's just cruelty. I was on jury duty and I watched it happen twice to 2 people in the same family. It was a trial for a historic sex offense against a child. Pretty awful stuff. Evidence in these kind of cases is really hard to come by, and it often comes down to a he said, she said, but not in this case. So, the defendant's wife takes the stand to act as his character witness, explain that he could never have committed these sex offenses he was accused of, etc. It was so obvious that she believed him. His whole family had decided to stand by him and said the young girl that was accusing him was making it up because her parents had a grudge against them. Halfway through her testimony, the prosecution pulls out their proof. They had texts he had sent to the young girl asking if she had had sex with her boyfriend yet, asking if she remembered their special cuddles. Super freaked up stuff to send to a child. She was 14 at the time, I think. The wife's face just crumpled. She couldn't say anything. That was one person. The second person was his daughter when the foreman read the guilty sentence. I was so sure that I was right when I voted guilty, but hearing her cry of anguish when he was sentenced was one of the most awful things that I have ever felt. She had believed him till the end, and I still think about it a lot. Knowing you did the right thing and knowing you destroyed someone else's life with it is a hard thing to hold in your head. In case anyone is wondering, there was more evidence than just the texts, but that was the moment that broke his wife. And any evidence at all in these kind of cases is a miracle. The judge basically told us when he summed up that he thought the guy was guilty, as much as he could, as judges aren't legally allowed to say that. Hey man, you've probably already heard this 1,000 times, but maybe you need 1,001. You didn't destroy anyone's life. That child molesting piece of crap destroyed his daughter's life. What you did was make sure he couldn't destroy another. I am watching it in slow motion with my mother and grandmother. My grandmother cared for her mother until she passed, and it was hard but manageable. Now my grandfather is dying, slowly and horribly, from Parkinson's. I am watching her fall apart, slowly. Her heart is giving up and she is losing the man she has been with for 60 years. She is worrying for her youngest son, who is a drug addict with an acquired brain injury, and knows she can't just give up. My mother is watching her parents go through this as my father gets sicker and sicker after chemo, and a lifetime of bad habits has destroyed his heart and his brain, and I am watching her slowly fall apart too. She is becoming crueler and harder, trying to shoulder as much of everything as she can, losing her dad and her husband, slowly and painfully. It's not a moment, it's a series of brutal horrible moments in waiting rooms and aged care units and car drives and watching people slowly fall into themselves and break their own hearts. Woman crying over a car seat while EMTs worked on the kid. Don't know how it turned out, but she was on the shoulder and I was in the left lane and I could hear her screaming. We'd had our first kid not too long before that. I got sort of drunk that night after the kid was asleep. Having kids makes one so much more sensitive to things like this. Now that we're parents, me and my GF get emotional all the time from stuff happening in movies. Me and my dad were playing Sly Cooper on the PS2 when my mom calls him into the dining room and he says it'll just be a few minutes. Well, 10 minutes go by and I'm wondering what's going on. I walk into the dining room and see my mom holding my dad in her arms and my dad absolutely bawling his eyes out. I've never, to this day, seen a grown man cry so much and be so absolutely devastated. His best friend that he had ever had just committed suicide. Me being about 3-4 at the time didn't really understand and I just kept asking him to come back and play with me. Looking back at it now, I feel so bad for what I did and didn't do. I'm 16 now. I can understand, but you did absolutely nothing wrong, and I'm sure you know this, but more importantly he likely not only thought the same, but was actually probably quite comforted by the reminder that he still had a child that loves him. The one that bothered me the most was transferring a patient back to the nursing home who just found out they had a couple months to live because of cancer. No family around, no one call, just me for support. I was a total stranger to the patient but the only one around to give support. The patient was elderly but still no one wants to see someone's grandparent find out they will be dead before Christmas. As a nursing home employee, thank you for being there for this patient. All too often we are the only family they have. Your support did not go unnoticed or unappreciated. I was at a friend's house for a sleepover and the next morning as we were eating breakfast, a guy on a motorcycle crashed right into the stop sign in front of their house. We saw it happen through the kitchen window. The parents called 911 and within the hour we were told the guy didn't survive and found out he was also the cousin of one of the other girls at the sleepover. So not only did she witness this guy's death, but it was her close relative. She just fell to the floor and lost it when she heard the news. There's just nothing you can say or do to help in a situation like that. Not so much fall apart, but it was really devastating to watch. I visited my sister for the first time in 5 years and she told me that her eldest daughter, 13, had been cutting herself and was suicidal. Usually there's nothing that can bring her down, but she just looked so defeated. I know that she has done everything she could for her kids and I also know that my niece wouldn't have shown any indication if she could. That day, I messaged her and told her that, if she ever needed a place to go, she could always come to me and that anything she told me would be kept in absolute confidence unless I thought she or someone else was in danger. I wish I could help her, but I know that there is nothing else I can do for my sister or my niece. I wish my mom reacted like that. When I was 11 I was self-harming. My mom even found my suicide letter and didn't say a word. I truly hope your sister and your niece are better now. Yeah, I was woken at about 7 AM while out of town by my then GF, potential soon to be fiancée, that her daughter was dead. The daughter that I had lived with and basically raised as my own for years, complete incoherent screaming and wailing past that, and then the paramedic taking the phone from her and explaining that resuscitation was not going to happen. And how freaking soon could I be here? Cue the most tense, surreal, erratic drive of my life, then doing what I could to comfort the person I loved the most in her darkest hour, which wasn't much. Tore not only her life, but then my life and the life we had built apart, irrevocably. It's been years, but it still rears its ugly head sometimes. Miss you, V. I am so very sorry for your loss, S. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.